Bale believes that social media is one of the largest drivers of the perception gap, and that the perception gap is changing us. He says, "We are addicted to social media not because it provides us with flashy eye candy or endless distractions, but because it helps us do something that humans are hardwired to do. Present different versions of ourselves, observe what other people think of them, and revise our identities accordingly. But instead of a giant mirror that we can use to see our entire society, social media is more like a prism that refracts our identities, leaving us with a distorted understanding of each other and ourselves. The social media prism fuels status-seeking extremists. It mutes moderates who think that there is little to be gained by discussing politics on social media, and leaves most of us with profound misgivings about those on the other side and even the scope of polarization itself. We look to social media and even traditional media like television and radio to help us understand the world around us. And we do this because we implicitly believe that social media or cable television can help bridge the divide between my view of the world and the way the world outside me actually is. Because of the number of people on social media and the amount of information that's on social media, we believe that what we see on social media accurately reflects the state of our world. The problem, though, is that social media gives an overwhelming amount of attention to the extremes of society in politics, culture, religion, and more. The views that we most often encounter on social media, cable news, and talk radio are often the most extreme versions of a particular viewpoint or idea. And because all we can really see are the extremes, it convinces us the extremes are more normal than they actually are. In reality, many of the perspectives we encounter represent the minority of their respective groups. But since we don't see the majority voicing their opinions and drowning out the minority opinions, we conclude that the minority voices are actually the majority voices, and that we should respond accordingly. In other words, there is a gap between how I perceive the world and the way the world actually is. And this is the essence of the perception gap. In the real world, the beliefs of your everyday fellow Americans are not represented by the extremes that you see on social media and cable news. But the problem is that we're living as though the extremes are actually normal and not the other way around. The perception gap is not just about the absence of information. It's also about misinformation and how we come to believe things that aren't true. The perception gap not only changes our beliefs, it changes our behaviors as well. When we talk about a gap, we can maybe think of an opening of some kind, like a gap between a train station platform and the train car. We can think of a gap as being a lack of something, like a gap in funds or a gap in time. We can even think of a gap in terms of something that's missing from a space, like that one missing piece of furniture in the living room, or a lack of a certain spice in your favorite meal. Things just aren't quite as good as they could be. The perception gap is something different, though. Instead of thinking of the perception gap as like a physical opening or something that's missing, we need to see the perception gap as a kind of force. The larger that gap grows, the stronger and more powerful that force becomes. Another way you could look at it is to see the perception gap as being like a tornado. And like any tornado that forms in the Dust Bowl, the bigger the tornado gets, the more powerful its destructive winds become. Maybe you've heard the phrase, nature abhors a vacuum before, and the same is absolutely true with the perception gap. We don't just leave these gaps empty. We fill those gaps with something to try to close them. And when it comes to people who are not like us, or who are on the opposite end of the political and cultural spectrum as we are, we don't fill those gaps with good intentions and charitable assumptions. We fill them with caricatures, misrepresentations, generalizations, and so much more. And the more the perception gap grows, the more powerful those caricatures, misrepresentations, and generalizations become. And eventually, they spill out into how we treat those who aren't like us. As we come to believe that others are more extreme than they actually are, the pressure of that force causes us to change our behavior towards others.